Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku found a home with a dog walk? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Aizawa Shouta was, very much so, not a dog person. That being said, his husband, Yamada Hizashi, very much was. It had started out as a teasing argument. Hizashi would mention wanting to get a puppy, and Shouta would remind him that puppies were a lot of work. Hizashi would show Shouta images of adoptable dogs at their nearby animal shelter, and Shouta would remind him that they already had 2 cats. Hizashi would beg and whine and plead, and Shouta would roll his eyes and put his foot down. It wasn't until later that Shouta realized that, no, Hizashi wasn't just teasing. It was on a late patrol one night that Shouta decided, after much debate with himself, that his husband deserved the happiness a dog would bring him. Shouta himself, after all, was very content with both of their stray alley cats he'd dragged home from work. Besides, a puppy couldn't be that much to handle. Not like an actual child or something. And so, on their mutual day off, a rare occasion that happened only once or twice per month, Shouta told Hizashi to get in the car. "Where are we going?" his husband asked, jumping around in his seat like an excited child. It took everything Shouta had to keep the smirk off his face. "It's a surprise, Zashi." "But you hate surprises." "Yeah, but you like them." Hizashi was already beaming, and they weren't even at the shelter yet. When Shouta pulled the car up into the shelter's parking lot, Hizashi very nearly burst into tears. He had thrown his arms around Shuda's neck, hugging his husband tightly and peppering his face with embraces, before throwing himself out of the car and into the front doors of the shelter, dragging poor Shouta behind him. "We're here to see the puppies," Hizashi cawed to the teenager at the desk, and it was only Shuda's quirk that kept his voice at a manageable level. In the end, they hadn't gotten a puppy. Mr. Teddy Bear, or Teddy, as Hizashi had dubbed him, weighed in at 60 pounds. He was a mutt with shaggy fur that stuck up in all different directions, giving him a fluffed-up appearance. The worker told the couple that Teddy had been abandoned by his owners when he grew too large for their daughter to play with. After hearing that the dog was only a year old and would possibly grow even larger, Shouta decided that Teddy was not the dog for them, or their 2-bedroom apartment. It was obvious that Hizashi had fallen head over heels, though, and Shouta bit back a sigh as he paid the adoption fee. At least his husband was happy. And besides, Teddy couldn't be that bad, right? Teddy was that bad. "Are you kidding me, you mutt?" Shouta huffed out as he pulled his destroyed shoe off of Teddy's bed. "This is the 3rd one, you hear me? Spork and BSD never destroy shoes." Hizashi frowned, looking put out. "Yeah, they only destroy your body. They've gotten better about mauling, Zashi." Ignoring the comment, Hizashi looked up from his laptop and said, "All of the websites are saying that he's just energetic. We need to take him on walks more, or maybe to the dog park. He could at least use some fresh air to play fetch for a while." Shouta should have expected that a dog would be more work than they could handle. Hell, Hizashi had 3 jobs. And Shouta was about to take on a second. Why had Shouta thought adopting a dog was a good idea? But then Shouta saw how Hizashi looked at Teddy. He saw how the dog cuddled up next to Hizashi when his husband was anxious, or how Teddy liked Hizashi's tears away during their traditional sad movie nights. And in turn, Shouta saw how Teddy looked at Hizashi, the human who had saved him, like he hung the moon and stars. But none of that took away the fact that they were busy as all hell. They'd have to divide up who walked Teddy, and Shouta would have to wake up early. Shouta let loose a heavy sigh, but before he could start speaking, there came a knock at their apartment door. He frowned. They weren't expecting any company. But then again, Namuri had a bit of a habit of forgetting to tell them when she was coming over. When Shouta opened the door, he hadn't expected to see a 4'0" child standing there. The child had a mess of dark curls on their head that shined green in the sunlight peering onto the 3rd-level porch. Their eyes, bright emerald, looked unsure as they fidgeted with an envelope, perhaps mislabeled mail. Maybe about 6 or 7 years old, the kid was tiny. It looked like a slight breeze could bowl them over. Or, it seemed, Shuda's 60-some-odd-pound mutt of a dog. "Teddy!" Shouta exclaimed furiously as he watched the dog hover over the child, attacking their freckled face with embraces. The child shrieked happily, mirthful giggles falling from their mouth as they wriggled under the dog, seemingly ticklish. It took a fair bit of Shuda's strength to wrench Teddy away from the child, and by then Hizashi had crossed over to the door and was grinning sheepishly. "Sorry, kiddo," the blonde said, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're still training him. He's got a lot of energy." The child's green eyes lit up like the sun. Seriously, Shouta could feel the heat bouncing off them. "I could walk him for you," the child chirped. Which was a terrible idea. Teddy was 60-something pounds and still growing. This kid looked like they could hardly weigh even that much, all gangly limbs and tiny stature. The only bit of baby fat Shouta could see on them was on their rounded cheeks. Shouta opened his mouth to deny the child, right as his husband exclaimed, "That sounds wonderful, kiddo." The kid turned out to be their next-door neighbor, a one Midoriya Izuku. Izuku was 8 years old and in the 3rd grade, one of the youngest in his class. He lived with his father, Midoriya Hizashi, who Shouta had yet to find present at home and be able to introduce himself to. Izuku walked Teddy every day before he went to school and every day after he got home. Shouta had been worried it was too much work for the child, getting dragged around by a dog that was quickly growing to be nearly twice his size, but Izuku had convinced the man otherwise. "I like walking Mr. Teddy." Izuku cheered. "He's fluffy and he doesn't mind me talking about my hero theories with him." Hizashi had asked if Izuku had friends that he was missing out on spending time with, and the boy had flushed darkly and murmured to the floor that he didn't have any friends. Hizashi and Shouta had exchanged a look but didn't press the issue. Izuku's school life wasn't much of a mystery, what with how much time the boy spent walking Teddy for them. Not to forget the fact that Izuku often came by with scraped knees and hands, dirt on his uniform, and would offhandedly mention missing homework to the two pro-heroes. Shouta had tried to go next door to express their concerns to Mr. Midoriya, but once again the man wasn't home. Which was almost even more concerning than the whole school thing. Just how often was Izuku left alone? Hizashi worried time and time again to his husband, which did nothing to help in Shuda's own nerves. Finally, one night, about a month into Izuku's new job, Shouta snapped at his husband, "Zashi, we can only do so much, okay? We can let Izuku know he's welcome here anytime, but we can't baby or parent him." Hizashi had pouted but relented. The next morning, when Izuku came by to pick up Teddy, Hizashi had reiterated Shuda's first statement to the boy, albeit much more gently. "You know, Izuku, if anything's going on at school or at home, you can come talk to us, right? The door is always open." Izuku had beamed, looking without a care in the world. "Thank you, Mr. Yamada. But I'm okay really." Hizashi had glanced over at his husband, completely unconvinced, while Shouta continued about feeding Spork and BSRD their morning wet food. "Okay," Hizashi replied hesitantly. "Mr. Yamada." Izuku chirped happily as he handed over an empty platter. "Thank you for the cookies. They were really good." "Oh wow. You and your dad already finished them?" Hizashi laughed back, taking the platter and walking towards the kitchen. Izuku was hovering in the entryway, having never really gone past the line between the main hallway adjacent to the door and their living room before. "You guys must have really enjoyed them, then." "I'm glad." Izuku seemed a bit hung up on the first statement, though, looking at the floor and pushing at the edge of the living room rug with his bright red shoes. I didn't really unshare them." "Izuku," Hizashi teasingly chided. "Did you keep those cookies all to yourself? How do you not have a stomachache?" "I did a little," Izuku murmured, "but it wasn't as bad as when I was hungry. I rationed the cookies, too. I promise I didn't eat them all in one day. But I needed a lunch to take to school, and we don't have anything at home that I could cook, and Izuku looked up and saw the shocked expression on Hizashi's face, his voice suddenly faltering. I don't dash." Shouta exited the bathroom, having heard the entire exchange, and glanced between his husband and small neighbor. Seeing that Hizashi was still silently panicking, Shouta sighed and went to crouch on one knee in front of Izuku, bringing the boy to his eye level. "Izuku," Shouta spoke evenly, softly, less gruff than he usually did. Does your father buy groceries? Why, yeah, he does. He does, I promise. I just don't know how to cook with the stuff he brings home. I can make rice. And I can cook grilled cheese? But Dad doesn't bring that kind of stuff home a lot. Let me reiterate, Shouta said. Does your father feed you? Yes. Izuku huffed emphatically. Dad brings home chips and stuff with his drinks and stuff, so I eat those most of the time. But he got upset last time I ate the whole bag, so I just ate the cookies Mr. Yamada made this time. Why's Mr. Yamada's face look like that, Mr. Aizawa? Honestly, Shouta was having a strong time keeping his own face level, but a quick look to his husband showed that Hizashi was hardly making an effort. The voice hero's face was bright red, his expression a mix of angry and distraught. While Izuku was looking at the floor, Shouta shot his husband a glare and signed for him to calm down. Hizashi did so, although only minutely. Izuku, Shouta began again, even softer than before. Please let us know if you're hungry, okay? I think Hizashi was going to make some katsudon for dinner a bold-faced lie, but Shouta knew from previous conversation that katsudon was Izuku's favorite, so he'd make a trip to the market for dinner. So we'll send some home with you after school, okay? And for lunch? Hizashi suddenly blustered. Quickly ransacking their kitchen, Hizashi made quick work of some leftovers and more than a few snacks, shoving them into his own lunch sack before racing into the hallway and handing said sack over to the little boy standing in their doorway. Please take this. I'll make sure to cook up some extra tonight so that you have lunch for tomorrow, too. And you'll have to tell me what foods you like so I can make more. Shuda's eyes fell on Izuku once more, and he winced when he saw that the child's radiant green eyes were filling with tears. Izuku sniffled, and just when Shouta thought the boy was going to reject Hizashi's lunchbox, the child took the sack with a damp, dismal smile. Thank you, Mr. Yamada, Izuku murmured. But I can't take all of your food? Hizashi's face melted into a fond, sad smile. It's really nothing, kiddo. Please. I'd feel much better if you'd help us not let all our extra food go to waste, yeah? Izuku still looked hesitant but seemed a bit more open to the idea when Hizashi laid it out as being helpful. Okay, Mr. Yamada. Thank you very much. Hizashi reached forward to ruffle Izuku's hair, and the boy's flinch didn't go unnoticed to either pro-hero. Please, Izuku, call me Hizashi. Or Zashi. Either way works. Okay, Mr. Zashi. Hizashi rolled his eyes, subtly kicking at his husband's crouched form. And call this one Shouta, yeah? Mr. Shouta, Izuku nodded in agreement. Shouta snorted a bit, and Hizashi groaned. You're too polite, kiddo, Hizashi bemoaned to the ceiling. You're so adorable. Izuku blushed deeply, and Shouta quickly went about gathering Teddy's HRs and leash, handing them over to Izuku. We can hold on to your lunch until you two get back. Just don't forget it, Izuku? Yes, sir, Mr. Shouta. When Izuku and Teddy left, Hizashi clung to his husband like a leech, fighting back tears and whispering, Is he safe, Shouta? Shouta couldn't answer. It wasn't always that the both of them were present or conscious whenever Izuku came by to get Teddy. Oftentimes, Shouta would still be in bed in the early mornings, or Hizashi would be on patrol in the afternoons. Izuku seemed comfortable enough with the both of them, though, that he didn't mind being alone with either pro-hero. Not that Izuku knew they were pro-heroes, although Shouta suspected the boy was onto something. Or at the very least, he was suspicious. Despite the boy's supposed suspicions, however, Izuku didn't bat an eyelash at their odd hours. Hizashi supposed it had something to do with the boy's father working so late in the evenings, and Izuku had mentioned that his late mother was a nurse, so the child was most likely used to strange timetables. All of which being said, that morning was like most others. Hizashi had left early, before Shouta or any of the animals had awoken, to go to the radio station. He'd done his job and come home to be greeted with licks and small woofs from Teddy while Spork and BSD mewed for their morning food. Chuckling, Hizashi went about fixing up breakfast and lunch for Izuku. Ever since the almost fiasco with the cookies, both Hizashi and Shouta had taken to fixing lunches and dinners for the boy. On a few memorable occasions, Izuku even ate dinner with them in their kitchen. The boy was fond of pork and green beans, but detested Brussels sprouts with a passion. Shoyuda had, in a bout of rare playfulness, dubbed the boy Sprout in honor of his hatred. The outraged sputtering that Izuku had aimed towards the man was, undoubtedly, the funniest thing Hizashi had seen in quite some time. As he finished up Izuku's lunch, tying off the bento box with a cute, embroidered napkin, because Hizashi could be a sap sometimes, and especially for the little neighbor that had wormed his way into his heart, a gentle knock came at the front door. Izuku had long since learned that Shoyuda kept to a varied sleep schedule, so the child tried often to be as quiet as he could until he knew if the man was awake or not. Actually, Izuku, for being such a passionate child, was often quiet. It was somewhat concerning to Hizashi, although Shoyuda made the point that they shouldn't judge too quickly. They'd only known the boy for a few months, after all. But still, Hizashi's gut instinct was telling him that something was very, very wrong in the Midoriya household. Going to answer the door, Hizashi greeted Izuku with a wide grin. "Hey, kiddo," he whispered emphatically. "Shuda's asleep, but come on in for a minute. I made breakfast." It had become a usual occurrence for Hizashi to feed Izuku breakfast as well. It worried Hizashi how Izuku never rejected any of the food, because what kind of home life was that showing for him? But at least the child had started gaining some weight. Hizashi couldn't count the boy's ribs when he hugged him anymore at least, which was saying something. "Good morning, Mr. Zashi," Izuku whispered right back. "Thank you for the breakfast." Izuku always said his please and thank yous, like the good little angel he was. Did Mr. Shoyuda have a late night? Shoyuda had gotten in around 2 in the morning, which was actually a bit of an early patrol for him. But 2 a.m. to an 8-year-old was ridiculously late, so Hizashi merely chuckled and nodded. "Yeah, he did. But he'll be awake when you come around to get Teddy this afternoon." "I'll be at work today." "Okay," Izuku nodded. "Mr. Teddy and I wanted to try a new route today, through the running trail at the park we go to." Hizashi paused for a moment, then frowned. "Izuku, the nearest park is almost 3 miles away. Are you really walking that far?" It was a horrible distance for such a small child to walk, even if he did walk himself to school every day. And it took him across a major intersection. Well, it would explain why Teddy was so calm at home if he was walking more than 6 miles every day. But that meant that Izuku had to be walking over 10 miles a day, or around that much, because of his commute to school, which didn't even cover his normal, throughout-the-day walking. Izuku must have misinterpreted Hizashi's frown, because the boy tensed and began to stammer, I don't have to take Mr. Teddy that far. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to dash." No, it's okay," Hizashi quickly interrupted the child before he could begin to panic too much. "I'm just concerned about you. Aren't you tired at the end of the day? 3+ miles is a lot, even for a spry little kid like yourself." Izuku brightened as he ate his breakfast, and Hizashi nearly melted under the child's pure, sunshine-wide gaze. "Oh, it's fine, Mr. Zashi. I like being away from the house. It's better. Better than what? Being around his father?" It wasn't the first slightly concerning statement Izuku had made, but none of his comments had ever been blatant enough to do anything about. Hizashi knew Shoyuda was keeping a close eye out for Mr. Midoriya ever since Izuku's admittance to not being fed properly, but the man must have kept even odder hours than the pro-heroes, because neither of them had yet to see him in the past 3 months of knowing Izuku. Again, concerning. "Okay then," Hizashi murmured, hoping he didn't sound as unconvinced as he felt. Izuku was placated enough by his statement, though, so Hizashi moved on to grab Teddy's irrevocably and leash. "But Izuku, if you ever want to just get away from your house or anything, you can always come over here, you know? You guys aren't always home," Izuku shrugged. Hizashi smiled softly, and then made the offer that he and Shoyuda had been speaking of for the past week or so. "We have an extra key. I'll give it to you today, and you can let yourself in whenever you want, whether we're home or not. I'm sure Teddy and the cats would like the company. That sound good, kiddo?" And why did Izuku look like he was about to cry? Hizashi quickly went to comfort the child, but Izuku managed to cut off his tears before they could start in earnest, sniffling and choking out. "Did you mean it, Mr. Zashi? I can really come over whenever?" "Of course," Hizashi promised with a smile. "Of course, I mean it, Izuku. And Shoyuda feels the same way. So please, let us welcome you." Let us take care of you, kiddo. Lord knows you could use it. Hesitating only for a moment, Izuku nodded. But, thank you, Mr. Zashi. And please tell Mr. Shouta thank you for me too. God, Hizashi was going to die from the cuteness of this freaking kid. Of course, kiddo. Now, you might want to head on out before Teddy dies of excitement. Izuku giggled wetly, going to take the leash from Hizashi. It was then that the sleeve on the boy's shirt rode up, and Hizashi caught a glimpse of pink, puckered skin around the child's wrist. Unable to stop from tensing, only barely able to keep in his gasp, Hizashi quickly took stock of the blistering burn that seemed to wrap around Izuku's pale skin like a grotesque bracelet. Izuku froze, noticing Hizashi's tension, and hummed in question. Kiddo, what happened to your wrist dash? Hizashi started, reaching out to take Izuku's hand. And Izuku flinched. It was a full-body motion, one that ripped the previous silent gasp out of the voice heroes as Izuku's emerald eyes were wide, wild, and fearful as they stared at Hizashi. Slowly, the man retracted his hands and held them upwards, trying to placate the frightened child. But Izuku didn't seem to be looking at Hizashi. If anything, the child seemed to be looking through him, lost in his own world, distracted by horrible thoughts or, perhaps, memories. It scared Hizashi. Hey, kiddo, can you talk to me? Izuku, sweetheart, please say something. You're safe. You're here, and I won't let anyone hurt you, okay? Izuku? Zashi? Came a sleepy murmur from the bedroom doorway. Shouta appeared, hair in wild disarray and rubbing sand from his eyes. Is Izuku still here? What dash, but then sleepy black eyes caught onto frightened lime green, and Shouta was lurching forward to crouch in front of Izuku next to his husband. Izuku? Sprout, you're okay. You're safe. Whatever you're seeing, it's not here. Not now. Izuku whimpered, and Shouta gently raised a hand. I'm going to touch your hand, Izuku. Please tell me to stop if you need me to. And then, as softly as he could, Shouta took Izuku's hand in his own, the boy's pale, sweaty hand looking oh so tiny beneath Shuda's own larger, calloused fingers, and rested the child's palm against his teach steadily. Shouta began to breathe in and out exaggeratedly, trying to get Izuku to follow the pattern. And it worked. Slowly, painfully slowly it worked. Izuku's eyes seemed to clear up, and they came to focus on the worried faces of the two pro-heroes crouching in front of him. The boy winced, quickly pulling his hand away from Shuda's tea, and began to search for Teddy's leash. I'm so sorry about T, the child stuttered. I'll just take Mr. T Teddy and G go and now. Izuku. Shuda's voice was calm and even but held no room for lying. Are you okay? I'm fine dash. I mean at home. Is everything alright? Suddenly, the boy's face twisted up in anger. It took Hizashi aback because he had never seen Izuku get angry before. The child's green brows scrunched up, and tears welled in his eyes as his face turned a dark pink. I'm fine. Izuku cried out. I'm okay, alright? Stop asking me if I'm okay because fine. Rather than rise to the boy's heat, Shouta raised his hands in a truce. But, alright. Everything's fine, Izuku, I'll stop asking about home, but he wouldn't stop investigating. Hizashi knew his husband well enough to know that. Anger gone, looking suddenly guilty, Izuku shuffled his feet against the carpet and bit his lip as he looked anywhere else but at the two men in front of him. It wasn't my dad. I'm fine at home, really? Hizashi cleared his throat. Was it someone else? Someone at school maybe? Izuku winced again, and Hizashi knew he'd hit the nail on the head. Kakant, he doesn't mean it, Izuku quickly said. He doesn't know any better. The teachers don't tell him not to, so his quirk is really strong, and I think it messes with his brain sometimes? But not just with his mind, but with his brain and sweat and stuff? Izuku looked frustrated, grabbing at his hair with a huff. It's strong to explain. This Kaken, Shouta began. He's not a friend of yours, is he? He used to be, was the quiet reply. And boy, if Hizashi's heart hadn't already broken 5 times that day. The dejected and utterly heartbroken look Izuku had was far too mature for such a youthful face. It was as much saddening as it was terrifying. You need to tell the teachers if someone's hurting you, Izuku dash. I have, the boy protested. They said I'm instigate it or a something. They said that Keikaken's good, and that he wouldn't hurt anybody. They don't care about, Izuku's words trailed off, and he muttered something. Hizashi asked, what was that last part? They don't care about a Deku like me. Oh, kiddo, Hizashi sniffled in time with Izuku's own tears, opening his arms in an offer. And for all that Izuku had been flinches and hesitation that morning, the child didn't seem to fear the embrace Hizashi was offering. Izuku flung himself forward, hugging Hizashi for all that he was worth. And Hizashi hugged him even tighter in response. Shouda rested a hand on Izuku's back, rubbing in soothing circles. We need to tend to your wrist before we go for that walk. Izuku asked, looking confused. Well, I'm already awake, aren't I? And Hizashi's not going anywhere for a few hours. Teddy's our dog anyways, we've got to take some responsibility for him. So we'll walk with you today. Like SWH being flipped, Izuku lit up and began rambling on about the new park route he wanted to take Teddy on. The dog in question sat next to the boy, head tilted in confusion even as he tried to sneak licks in on the child's freckled face while Izuku gestured wildly. Hizashi went to grab his shoes, feeling his throat close up when he glanced behind him and saw the fond smile Shouda was fixating on Izuku. The boy wasn't theirs, Hizashi had to remind himself. They could fight for him and offer him solace and try to encourage him, but Izuku wasn't theirs. He couldn't let himself forget that. Hey, Sprout, do you think you can do us a favor tomorrow night? Shouda asked one morning over breakfast, watching Izuku shovel eggs into his mouth and making a mental note to have Hizashi put a second helping in his lunch that day. They had at least some control to be able to help Izuku have breakfasts and lunches, but they didn't know what he did for dinners. At least a second helping could be enough to keep his little belly full overnight, or perhaps could be saved for dinner. Beneath the table, Teddy was scavenging for scraps. Off on either barstool to the left of the kitchen, Spork and Bee were staring down on the dog with ill-hidden annoyance. Teddy had gotten into their wet food the night before, and the cats seemed to be holding a grudge. When Izuku nodded, Shouda continued. It's Hizashi's birthday tomorrow, so we'll be out all night with some friends. Would you be willing to stay here overnight to watch Teddy? We've never left him overnight by himself before, Hizashi explained as he piled more rice onto Izuku's plate. And he has a bad habit of attacking Shou's shoes, so we're anxious to leave him alone for too long. But Hizashi hadn't needed to pry or butter the child up, because Izuku's eyes were already glistening with excitement. Yeah. Yes, 1,000,000 times yes. Mr. Teddy and I are gonna have so much fun. Izuku threw a fist in the air, and a bit of egg flew off the chopsticks in his hand. Teddy lunged for the food, knocking into Shuda's chair and nearly sending the man flying. He quickly caught his balance, shooting a red-eyed glare at the dog that did absolutely nothing. Izuku giggled, though, which made it not all for naught. Okay. Hizashi clapped his hands together, grinning. But I need you to let your dad know that you'll be over here, okay? And maybe you should ask his permission to stay the night? Izuku shrugged and said, he won't care. He won't be home anyways. Hizashi bit his lip, exchanging a long glance with his husband, but Shouda didn't react. The underground hero may have been compiling evidence against the supposed abuse and definite neglect in the Midoriya household, but he had sworn to Izuku he would stop prying about the boy's home life. It was all so frustrating, knowing that the child was so close to their home, to safety, to love, and yet still so far. Izuku was a Midoriya, not an Aizawa or a Yamada. They couldn't do anything, even as pro-heroes, unless the boy blatantly came to them and said he was being abused. They could try and wheedle it out of him, but the couple was worried about pushing Izuku too far and having him run away out of fear. They could be of no use to the child if he wouldn't talk to them, after all. They just had to show Izuku they were trustworthy, and then everything would work out in the end. It's so cool that our birthdays are in the same month, Mr. Zashi. Izuku exclaimed happily as he not so surreptitiously fed Teddy a piece of chicken under the table. Shouda lightly nudged the child's shin with a sock toe, and Izuku giggled and squirmed. They are they? Hizashi grinned. What day is your birthday, Izuku? The 15th. Izuku chirped back, kicking his little feet in the air and laughing when Spork ran under them, purring to be petted. Ooh, that's a Saturday! Hizashi exclaimed, matching Izuku's enthusiasm right back. Saturday is the perfect day for a birthday. Do you have anything fun planned? The kicking of his feet slowed, and Izuku looked down at his plate with a bit of a muted frown. He didn't seem quite upset, just contemplative. Not really. Dad won't be home and I don't have friends, really. Then, to Hizashi's horror and Shuda's resignation, Izuku shrugged. It's not a big deal anyways. I'm only turning 9. And hell, what kind of soon-to-be 9-year-old didn't get excited for their birthday? Well, Shouta supposed, the kind that has nothing to look forward to. When Hizashi tried to meet his husband's eyes again, Shouta acquiesced and gave a subtle nod. Well, buddy, Hizashi started slowly, what if we all went to the park that day? We can take Teddy with us. Ooh, and I can make us some snacks and some cake, and we can buy some sodas dash. Might as well have a picnic, Shouta deadpanned, although Hizashi could see the wry smirk hidden behind the man's hand. That's a great idea, Sho. Hizashi cheered. Then, whirling around to face Izuku, Hizashi continued on. What I say, kiddo? Does a picnic sound good to you? And hell, Hizashi knew that Izuku was a crier, but did the kid have to have such big, bright, emerald-y eyes to go with those massive tears? Really? Izuku croaked. You'd do all tea, for me? Putting as much sincerity into his voice as he could, Hizashi took Izuku's hand in his own and said, Of course we would, kiddo. But I don't even have a dash, but then Izuku cut himself off, looking a bit horrified at whatever he had been about to say. Quickly, the child changed gears and said, I can't even repay you guys. For dash. You don't have to repay us for anything, Izuku, Shouta interrupted the child. If anything, we have to repay you for walking Teddy for us. Hizashi was quick to interject, but that's not what the picnic is about. We're not looking to compensate you, Izuku, we just want you to dash, feel loved, know that we care. Because we do. Izuku was quiet a moment, looking as confused as could be. But then, the boy slowly nodded. I don't understand. But I appreciate it. And you? I like you guys, Mr. Hizashi, Mr. Shouta. Hizashi watched on, sickeningly fond, as his husband murmured back to the child, We like you too, Izuku. The night of Hizashi's 25th birthday was, admittedly, much tamer than the years beforehand. Nemuri had tried to get him to take more shots with her, but Hizashi stopped after 2 with a meaningful smile and the excuse of wanting an earlier night. Tensei got a little more drunk than he usually would have let himself, but that was due to the fact that he was taking all of the shots that Hizashi was refusing. Can't let Nem's money go to waste, Tensei giggled tipsily, raising his glass before tapping it on the table and shooting it back. Shouta was their designated driver and taking his job very seriously. Typically, he'd allow himself a single beer earlier on in the night if he was driving, but he was taking the same restraint as his husband that night and sticking to plain water. Nemuri pouted, cheeks rosy and body slouching as she leaned over the table. You two are killjoys, you know. And Zashi, it's your birthday. Why are you letting Shouta rub off on you so much? Her eyes suddenly lit up wickedly, and she giggled maniacally. Is it because you want to be able to rub off on him tonight? Oh, I should have known Sho's got the rap on best birthday present, doesn't he? Hizashi rolled his eyes as his husband hid a blush. Relax yourself, Nim. We just want to get home in time to make sure the little listener is okay. Tensei frowned, brow furrowed in confusion as he slurred, Oh yeah, you guys got a kid now, right? What? Nemuri shrieked, grabbing the attention of the immediate bar patrons around them. Shouta groaned, hiding his face in his hand as Nemuri leaned further across the table to grab onto Hizashi's collar. Tell me all about them, Hizashi. Do they have Sho's quirk? Are they blonde like you? What's their favorite animal? And what dash? Hizashi chuckled, shaking his head and prying Nemuri's fingers off his now wrinkled button-down. We already told you, Nim. He's not ours, he's just our next-door neighbor. Midoriya Izuku? Remember? The little kid who's been walking Teddy. Teddy? Shouta deadpanned without looking up from his hand. Artendog, Kiyama? Nemuri shot a finger into the air and proclaimed, Ah yes. That's right. Before slumping back down into her chair and cozying up to Tensei's shoulder. The man giggled and hiccuped, allowing his friend's space to wriggle under his arm. You two better get home soon then, Namuri hiccuped. It's already 2. What? Hizashi exclaimed, checking his watch. Shoyuta, why didn't you say anything? I was about to. Shoyuta rolled his eyes as he brought car keys out of his pocket. Come on, let's get them home so we can go check on our Izuku. Tensei giggled and Namuri mouthed, our Izuku, widely before laughing. Shuda's blush deepened and he smacked the back of Namuri's head. Let's go already, you drunken problem children. Shu, we're adults. Yeah. That's how we're allowed to be drunken. Children. I'm friends with absolute children. Fortunately, Tensei was spending the night on Namuri's couch so he didn't have to run or take the train all the way back to Tokyo, which meant only one stop before Shoyuta and Hizashi could make their way home. Upon entering their apartment, the couple was greeted by a mewling spork and BSRD. Teddy's head popped up sleepily from the front of the couch. He gave a tiny woof as if trying to keep quiet, before settling his head back down atop a nest of green curls. Hizashi grinned as he crept around the couch, leaving Shoyuta to go put their things away in the bedroom. But when he saw Izuku's face, Hizashi's heart lurched in his iti. The child's typically pale skin had taken on a sickly hue, and sweat was dripping down his brow. Izuku's breaths came in little huffs, and his eyes were squeezed tightly shut as he half-burrowed himself under Teddy's weight. The dog in question gave a whimper before liking at Izuku's cheek. The boy huffed and shifted, clearly overheated and uncomfortable. Hizashi reached a hand forward, brushing hair away from Izuku's brow before testing the boy's temperature with his palm. And hell, the kid was burning up. His skin, as clammy as it was, felt like the metal sides of a boiling pot. Shoyuta, Hizashi whisper-yelled, trying not to wake up the child. Shoyuta. Hizashi's worry must have shown in his voice, because all of a sudden Shoyuta was there, crouching in front of Izuku and shoving his husband's hand aside to get his own feel on the boy's temperature. Frowning, brow creased deeply, Shoyuta grunted, definitely feverish. I'll get some medicine. Can he have normal medicine? Like adult medicine? He's only 8. And he's tiny. What if we accidentally gave him too much? But there aren't any pharmacies open right now. It's almost 3 in the morning. Shoyuta, what if he gets too feverish? Oh God, we have to take him to the hospital dash. Calm down, Zashi, Shoyuta snapped, his agitation betraying his own concern. Get some cool rags and some juice for him to sip on when he wakes up. The corner store is still open and they're bound to have at least some children's Tylenol. I'll run over and get some. It was at moments like this that Hizashi was eternally grateful for his husband. He was normally good about controlling his anxiety, but when it ran wild, Hizashi could hardly think. Shoyuta, for all his own issues, always seemed to be able to calm his husband down even as concerned as he was, as well. Thanks, babe, Hizashi murmured, embracing Shuda's cheek and making the man roll his eyes. Yeah. Just don't let him puke on the carpet. And thus, Shoyuta left to go get medicine while Hizashi dug around in their bathroom cabinet for a thermometer. With a triumphant whisper shout, the man found it and took it back into the living room. Izuku whimpered when Hizashi ran the cool metal of the thermometer against his forehead, and Hizashi cooed at the boy. Oh, Aizu, he murmured when he read the temperature on the device. 39.2 degrees Celsius per 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's no good, kiddo. We've got to get you cooled off. Wrangling Teddy away from Izuku was a battle in of itself, the dog now weighing a whopping 80 pounds and stubbornly gluing himself atop his child caretaker. Really, Teddy, now's not the time. Hizashi snapped as quietly as possible, dragging the dog off the couch by his underarms. Jesus, we've got to put you on a diet. Boof, came the indignant reply. Okay, no diets. Just move. But moving Teddy proved to be a bit too much activity, because Izuku was blinking awake blearily. Mr. Zizashi, the child huffed out, rubbing at bloodshot eyes. Sorry. Hizashi's heart melted a bit at the sight of the child clutching at a throw pillow and rubbing sleep from his eyes. Oh kiddo, you have nothing to be sorry for, okay? Everyone gets sick every now and then. I'm sorry that we didn't notice you weren't feeling well. In truth, Hizashi had noticed that Izuku looked a bit more tired than usual. But given that it was 8 p.m. when they left, he'd allowed his husband to brush away his concerns in favor of going out with their friends. They'd thought Izuku was just sleepy. And now Hizashi was kicking himself for it. But he needed to push his self-loathing away for the moment. He had a sick child to be tending to. How are you feeling? Anything hurting? Your head? Your stomach? Izuku wriggled against the couch, looking absolutely miserable. My head hurts, the child whimpered. It's really CC cold, Mr. Hizashi. I know, kiddo, Hizashi murmured sadly, grabbing a blanket from the basket next to the couch. He spread it out atop the child, tucking in Izuku's legs and socked feet. Shouda went to get you some medicine. He'll be back soon, okay? But I think we have some crackers that might help settle your stomach if you're hungry. Miserably, Izuku shook his head. Don't wanna eat anything. Just tea throw it you up. Wastin' food? Hizashi frowned pointedly, then quickly relaxed his expression when Izuku blinked up at him. Mr. Hizashi, the child whimpered. Seek an eye, and then, shaking his head, the boy huffed out, never mind. Crouching to be eye level with his little neighbor, Hizashi murmured, What is it, Izuku? You can ask, it's okay. Izuku sniffled, then let out a broken sob. See, can I have a HH hug? Hizashi's heart broke a little as he reached out his arms. Oh, kiddo. Of course you can. You can always have a hug, sweetheart. When Shouda returned home, arms laden with medicine, crackers, ginger ale, and countless other items, he found his husband curled up on the couch with Izuku in his lap. The boy's head was leaning against Hizashi's shoulder, and the man was running his fingers through the child's sweaty locks while he rocked in place and hummed. Hey, Shouda said quietly, smirking when Izuku blinked at him owlishly. Not feeling too hot, huh, Sprout? No, Mr. Shuda. Feelin' too hot? Setting the bags down on the coffee table, Shouda addressed his husband. What's his fever at? Let me check again. For a moment, it was only the beeping of the thermometer in the quiet of their living room. But then, Hizashi was hissing and murmuring to his husband, 40.1 degrees C/104.1 degree F. Shouda grabbed some crackers and a bottle of ginger ale from a sack, opening both and handing them over to Izuku before grabbing his husband's arm and pulling Hizashi towards their bedroom. We'll be right back, kiddo, Shouda promised over his shoulder. Snack on that for a minute. Closing the door, leaving it cracked in case Izuku called for them, Shouda crossed his arms over his tea and turned to his husband. We need to take him to the hospital. I agree. But, Shouda, what about Dash? His father, Shouda grumbled, sighing heavily. Running a hand through his own dark, tangled locks, the underground hero grunted. We don't have any custody or guardianship over Izuku, so they'll contact his father Dash. If they can even get a hold of the BSTRD, Hizashi ground out. And his father will likely not be happy that two strangers took his son to a hospital. We've tried to introduce ourselves. He's never home. He could stop us from seeing Izuku, Shouda said solemnly, and then we'd have no way to protect him. And, well, Hizashi had nothing to add to that. But, Shouda continued on, we can't just leave this untreated. So what do we do, Sho? The only thing we can do, Shouda said solemnly. Call for reinforcements? I am much too old to be making 4 a.m. house calls, young man, Chio grumbled as she ambled into their apartment at 3:49 in the morning. Did you even try giving the lad some medicine? Right before we called you, Shouda confirmed. His fever's plateaued. It won't go down, and he's practically catatonic, Hizashi fretted. He was once more positioned sitting on the couch with Izuku on his lap, and sure enough, the boy's glazed-over eyes were staring at nothing, his tiny fingers loosely curled around Teddy's fur as the dog whimpered and licked at his arm. He's covered in goosebumps and he was insisting earlier he was cold, but he's burning up, Shizenji and Dash. You two fret like new mothers, Chio huffed out as she settled on the couch next to Hizashi and Izuku. The boy will be fine. Then she puckered her lips and gave Izuku a peck on the cheek. The effect was almost instantaneous. Izuku's cheeks began to go rosy again, less gray than before, and his breathing evened out. Hizashi raised a hand to Izuku's forehead, sighing in relief when he could physically feel the fever starting to seep out of the kid. Thank you, Shizenji, he said emphatically. Yes, Shoyuta nodded his agreement, brushing some hair from Izuku's face. Thank you. We owe you 1, 2, 5, 20. You two owe me plenty more than 1, young man, Chio chided the hero in response. And then, just as quickly as she had arrived, Recovery Girl left, sweeping out of the apartment with a huff. Shoyuta offered her a ride home, but the woman shrugged him off. Just stay and take care of that boy, you hear me, Aizawa? He clearly needs it. Shoyuta put the groceries away while his husband tended to Izuku, but before long, the couple was seated on the couch with Izuku between them. The child's feet were in Hizashi's lap, and his face was curled up towards Shuda's stomach. The underground hero, softer than his husband had seen him in a long while, was running his fingers through Izuku's hair in mimicry of Hizashi's earlier motions while his other hand flipped through TV channels via remote. The volume was off to allow Izuku rest, but they always had subtitles on anyways. Leaning towards his husband's shoulder, Hizashi rested his hand on Izuku's knee from atop the blanket the child was wrapped in. Shoyuta? We're in this deep, aren't we? I mean, he's our kid, Shoyuta. We can't lose him, not to sickness and not to his father and not to anything. We can't lose him, Dash. I know, Zashi, Shoyuta sighed, silencing his husband with a chaste embrace. I know. With Recovery Girl's assistance, and boy, was Izuku devastated when the boy heard he'd slept through the youthful heroine's visit. Izuku was completely healthy by the time Monday and school rolled around. And, to Shuda's and Hizashi's collective relief, the rest of the week seemed to fly by with no incidents whatsoever. Izuku didn't say anything concerning about his father, and the boy that was bullying him at school seemed to be laying off a bit. Or at least, Kaken was laying off on the physical side. But Izuku hadn't seemed sad that week either. If anything, with each ramping day towards the child's birthday, Izuku became more and more eager. By the time Saturday morning rolled around, the boy was vibrating with excitement, jumping on the ball of his feet as he grabbed Teddy's leash and Reassurance from the hallway closet of his own accord. Come on, Mr. Zashi. Izuku trilled, we're going to the park. All together. The child finished off his sentence with a noise that made him sound like a sentient, screeching kettle. Hizashi couldn't help but laugh. Shoyuta may have still been in bed, but Hizashi couldn't bring himself to tell Izuku to quiet or calm down. Not when he hadn't seen the boy this excited since months earlier when Shoyuta had finally bit the bullet and allowed Izuku to question him about his quirk. They'd found out that the child was an eager little quirk analyst then, as Izuku scribbled in as small a font as he could in a ratty notebook, trying to conserve pages for more analysis. It's still only 9 in the morning, kiddo, Hizashi teased. Although we could do brunch instead of lunch, if you're ready to go? Yes. Izuku all but shrieked, earning a loud groan from the bedroom. Hizashi chuckled, shaking his head as his husband slumped into the doorway wearing his favored pink sweatpants and a long-sleeved put your hands up radio t-shirt. Time it? Shoyuta slurred as he stumbled into the kitchen, inging around the cabinets for a mug. He missed when he went to pour his coffee, and Izuku dutifully trotted over to the man and took over making Shuda's coffee for him while the hero glared at the spill on the counter. Hizashi rolled his eyes, because really, people said he was the dramatic one in their relationship as he tossed a towel over to his husband for the mess to be cleaned up. Shoyuta huffed and did so half-heartedly as Hizashi spoke. It's time enough for you to be getting showered and ready, mister. We're having brunch today. At the park. Izuku cheered, still vibrating in excitement and sloshing hot coffee around in the mug, somehow not spilling a drop as he turned to Shoyuta. With Mr. Teddy. And you. And Mr. Zashi. To me. And Dash. Shing. Shoyuta groaned, taking the mug from Izuku and downing it in a few meager gulps. Kid, I love you, but please use your inside voice. At least until I'm on my second mug of coffee. Hizashi stilled, grateful that Izuku was facing somewhat away from him so that he could blatantly stare at the boy's reaction to Shuda's words. Sure enough, Izuku had caught on to what Shoyuta had missed in his sleep-addled state, and the child's ears and face were turning a hot red shade that clashed with his dark green hair. Izuku started, then made the same kettle-like noise from earlier as Shoyuta slumped off to the bathroom to get ready. Hizashi quickly took pity on the boy, drawing Izuku's attention to the picnic basket that he'd dug out of their storage closet off to the side of the balcony. He'd had to dust it off and had shrieked loud enough to wake the neighbors when he'd seen a spider inside of it, but Shouda had taken care of that. After changing out the lining of said basket with a fresh gingham print cloth, and no, it didn't look tacky, Shouda, it looked cute, the basket was ready to be loaded up with foods. However, Hizashi had not yet asked Izuku what kind of food he would want for the picnic. Of course, the man had mentioned finger sandwiches and cake and such, and Izuku was surely an easy child to please, but Hizashi wanted this to be perfect. It wasn't every day that your child turned 9, after all. And oof. Hizashi had to bite the inside of his cheek at that thought. If Izuku could hardly take hearing Shouda say that he loved the kid, then surely the boy wouldn't be able to stand hearing Hizashi's thoughts on parenting. Because that was what they were doing, right? It had been months, and they still hadn't seen hide nor hair of the ever-elusive Mr. Midoriya. Hizashi had a worrying theory going on that he had yet to share with his husband, but he knew that Shouda was likely thinking the same, what with the man's extensive underground experiences. Shouda had a kind of radar for trouble that Hizashi was jealous of. Rather than finding villains and criminals himself, trouble seemed to find Hizashi. But Shouda seemed to have a freaking Doppler for villains and stray cats and problem children, all the sorts. That being said, Hizashi had eyes. He could observe that things were not right in the Midoriya household. If there was even a household to begin. Quickly, Hizashi shook his head. Today was not a day for those thoughts. There would always be tomorrow to fix Izuku's situation, because today was a day for celebration and joy and laughter. He'd accept nothing else for his child. Instead of dwelling, Hizashi cleared his throat and asked, "What do you want for brunch, kiddo?" After making the finger sandwiches he'd planned for, and Izuku had apparently been looking forward to those after all, and cutting up some fruit into nice little stars and rabbits, because Izuku reminded him of a bunny with the way the child was hopping around the kitchen excitedly, yammering on about the newest hero fight he'd seen on the news. Hizashi went to grab the cake from the fridge. He'd picked it up from the fancy bakery nearby his hero agency the day before, special ordering it a week in advance, flashing his hero ID unabashedly at the short timetable, because Izuku would have the perfect birthday, damn it, and had to beat away his husband's sticky little fingers when the man saw it. Because who could have known that strawberry jam cake would be Shuda's and Izuku's favorite? Izuku's eyes lit up at the little frosted flowers on the cake, and he made a noise of awe when Hizashi took the plastic cover off the tray. "We can't fit the whole cake in the basket," the man explained, "but we'll be sure to bring some of it. The rest you can have for dessert later on this week. Okay, kiddo?" Izuku chirped back, nodding emphatically as Hizashi giggled. The child looked like a bobblehead, what with all of his excitement. A firm yet gentle hand on the top of the child's head stopped his nodding. Shouda, having just emerged from the bathroom fully dressed with his damp hair pulled into a low ponytail, rolled his eyes. "Stop that, Sprout. You'll give yourself whiplash." Turning to his husband, Shouda gave Hizashi a peck on the cheek before looking back at Izuku. "You two ready? Just need to grab my shoes and jacket." Hizashi confirmed, sharing a knowing glance with his husband about the packages they'd lovingly wrapped and tucked away in their bedroom closet, away from where Izuku would be able to see them until the timing was right. "Be right back, and don't eat the cake yet, I mean it, Shouda." Shouda turned to Izuku and rolled his eyes, throwing a thumb backwards at Hizashi as the voice hero went to grab his things. Izuku giggled, then began rambling once more, this time about some up-and-coming hero named Miruko that Shouda had only briefly heard of, while Shouda went about finishing packing some water bottles. Shortly thereafter, the trio plus Teddy began making their way towards the park. Shouda held onto Teddy's leash while his husband took the admittedly heavier picnic basket, earning him a side-eye from his husband. Izuku, in a great show of stamina, skipped a little over halfway there, weaving in and out from between Hizashi's and Shuda's slow-walking forms. Teddy was getting worked up at the boys' antics, making low boofs as Izuku giggled and pet the dog's ears before skipping off again. In fact, Hizashi was absolutely positive that Izuku was going to skip the entire way to the park. Or at least he was, until Shouda sighed heavily, handing Teddy's leash over, and stepped forward easily to snatch Izuku out of thin air. tossing the child over his shoulders with ease that should have only come with practice. And yet, Shouta looked like a complete natural, unable to hide his small smile for lack of capture scarf as Izuku clutched to his hair, shrieking with mirthful giggles. Hizashi wished he had a hand free to take a picture. Because with the sun shining, a gentle summer breeze blowing, and the two most important people in his life with him, how could this moment be anything but picture perfect? And then it happened. It had been Hizashi who suggested they go the long way, around the marketplace and through an alley. Sure, it would add a little bit to their walk, but the marketplace would be crowded and bustling at mid-morning on a Saturday. And so Shouta had readily agreed, promising to keep an eye on Izuku for signs of tiring. But what with the boys' usual intensive workouts, Hizashi wasn't too worried. And the fact that the outskirts of the marketplace were usually desolate were comforting too. They wouldn't have to worry about Izuku running off into a crowd. With two pro heroes and a collective near 15 years of hero work between them, one would have thought they would be more careful. But Shouta was distracted with Izuku pulling on his hair, trying to hide his growing grin from the child as Izuku kicked at his blabbering on about heroes again. Shouta had endured long and arduous patrols for the past 3 nights, and Hizashi knew his husband had hardly a full night's rest between the past 72 hours. Shouta was operable, but only barely, and his tiredness from being awoken early wasn't doing him any favors either. And Hizashi had Teddy and the picnic basket in hand, his focus solely on his doting husband and the kid who was quickly becoming theirs. With Eraserhead and present Mike, it shouldn't have happened. But it did. Before either hero could react, 2 figures appeared in front of them, another 2 behind. All of the figures were dressed much too heavily and darkly for the summer heat, and Hizashi knew immediately that they were trying to hide weapons. Wallets, one of the men in front of them, a red-haired man with glowing yellow eyes, snapped. "And that pretty watch of yours, Blondie?" Shouta had tensed up as soon as the 4 criminals appeared, his clutch on Izuku's legs turning painfully tight. Izuku wriggled, whimpering in fear, and Shouta forced himself to loosen his grip ever so slightly. Behind the hero, Teddy had tensed up and was growling at the snake-faced woman and the lion-maned man that had appeared behind them, his hackles raised. And for once in his life, Hizashi froze. He hadn't frozen in the face of danger since he was a child, all noble-limbed and rosy-cheeked, muzzled for his own good. But now, staring at his husband and child, noting the worry in Shuda's eyes and the utter terror on Izuku's face, Hizashi couldn't help but hesitate. Only for a moment. It was just a single FNG moment. A moment too long, because the snake-faced woman hissed, and something about the noise set Teddy off. The dog rushed at her, clamping sharp canine teeth down on her wrist, and she shrieked. And then it happened. The red-haired man reached out for Izuku, and he must have had a telekinetic-type quirk because the boy went flying right off Shuda's shoulders. Shouting in anger, Shouta flashed his own quirk at the man, erasure forcing Izuku to drop to the ground with a painful thud halfway between the men. Shouta darted forward, reaching out for Izuku, and the 4th attacker made himself known. By digging a knife into Shuda's ribs. The underground hero gasped, a terrible, gurgling noise that sent rage flowing through Hizashi's veins. Throwing down the basket in his hand, Hizashi roared, "Nuo!" quirk in full effect as he aimed it over the huddled forms of his husband and child on the ground. The rippling effect had Izuku throwing his hands over his ears, crying out in pain and fear, but the brunt of the blast threw the attackers in front of them back by several yards. Whirling around, ready to take on the other 2 attackers, Hizashi found himself shocked when he saw the snake woman on the ground, still bleeding from her wrist and unconscious, and the lion-maned man tucking tail and running, already too far away for Hizashi to hit him with voice without causing some severe property damage. Teddy, a light spackling of BLD on the dog's teeth, was looking quite pleased with himself as he darted past his blonde owner at lightning speeds, clamping his jaws onto the red-haired man's ankle and shaking. The man screamed, kicking at the dog, but Teddy held on tight. "Jesus Christ, that thing's a f***ing demon dash," the dark-haired man shouted, only to be cut off by a strand of white capture weapon wrapping around his face and slamming him into concrete ground. "Shouta!" Hizashi cried out in relief, turning to his husband. The sight that greeting him was bewildering. Because, sure, Izuku was quickly becoming theirs, but Hizashi never thought he'd see his husband look so feral with a child tucked away in his arms. While one arm clasped Izuku to his hip, pressing the child into the alley wall, effectively hiding him behind Shuda's own body, the other arm held firm to his capture weapon as he maneuvered the device to knock their dark-haired attacker unconscious. Hizashi quickly rushed to dispatch the red-haired thug, knocking him out with a not-so-kind kick to the head. Only then did Teddy release the man, limping over to where Shouda was half-collapsed against Izuku and the brick wall. Immediately after, Shouda fell to one knee, his grip on his capture weapon going slack in favor of his hand rushing to the ever-growing dark spot on his right side. "Sheet," the man gurgled, BLD rushing past his lips and trickling down his chin. "Zizash, he groaned, and Hizashi only had a moment to rush forward and grab his husband's arm before Shouda fell completely. Glancing over his husband's bowed head, Hizashi felt his heart break when he saw Izuku's horrified, rapidly paling face. The child was crying, attempting to muffle his sobs with two tiny, shaking hands. Kiddo, Hizashi murmured, his free hand going to slide Izuku's hair. The boy flinched violently and Teddy whimpered. Sweetheart, are you hurt? And no, Izuku sobbed out quietly, still attempting to muffle himself as he shook his head side to side. But Mr. Shuda is going to be fine, okay, sweetheart? I'm calling an ambulance now. Hizashi broke away from speaking with Izuku to do just that, quickly reeling off the street corner they were closest to before handing the phone to Izuku. Kiddo, I need you to talk to the operator for me so they can trace our call, okay? The trained operator would also hopefully be able to keep Izuku calm while Hizashi administered much-needed first aid to his husband. Okay. Izuku's voice wobbled as he took the phone, and Hizashi allowed the child's muffled, stammered one-word responses to the operator to wash over him as he turned to his husband. It wasn't good. Shouda had completely slumped to the ground, and the hand that had once been trying to apply pressure to his ribs was now slack. There was a growing dark stain that was already taking over half of Shuda's torso, and when Hizashi went to press on it, Shouda didn't respond. For a heart-stopping moment, Hizashi couldn't tell if his husband was breathing. But then, holding his hand in front of Shuda's mouth, Hizashi felt the slight puffs of air and sighed in relief. Hizashi murmured to the other hero. You just had to go and get yourself hurt, didn't you? Zizash, Shouda grumbled. Hizashi could have nearly cried with relieved laughter, but he had a job to do. He'd hesitated earlier, and it had cost him. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Even with his hearing aids in, Hizashi hadn't noticed the sound of an ambulance until one was right on them. He'd been too focused on trying to keep Shouda awake and Izuku calm, all while putting as much pressure on the wound as he dared to. The BLD on his husband's lip and chin weren't promising, and what with the position the knife had slipped between his ribs Shouda likely had a punctured lung that was quickly filling with BLD. 2 EMTs rushed to either side of Hizashi, and the man quickly reeled off the meager first aid he'd administered, along with a few stats he'd gathered on his husband's quickly declining health. The blonde EMT nodded, then attempted to shuffle in between Hizashi and his husband. Stiffening, Hizashi held his ground, gritting out, I need to stay with him. I'm his husband. Sure, Shouda grunted, eyes glazed over as he strained to hold his head up and look at his husband. Sprout needs you. Sprout? Hizashi muttered back, stroking a hand down his husband's cheek, blatantly ignoring the tint of red BLD it left in its wake. I'll take care of Sprout, okay? So you just focus on being okay? Please Shouda grunted back, and Hizashi finally stepped away from his husband's limp form, turning to look for Izuku. And Hizashi's heart couldn't have shattered into any more pieces. Because Izuku was crouched between a dumpster and Teddy, curled up into a ball as he gripped the dog's wiry fur, sobbing into the tufts as he hid his face away from the world. Zukadash, Hizashi murmured, reaching a hand forward. Teddy snarled, hackles raising as he bared his teeth at his own owner, black eyes seemingly fixated on Hizashi's bloodied hand. Teddy, Hizashi admonished in as gentle a voice as he could muster. Teddy, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt him. And Mr. Teddy, Izuku sobbed, heaving as he struggled to breathe. "It's okay? It's Mr. Hizashi." Something about the boy's voice seemed to relax the dog, even though Izuku's rapid breathing was worrying Hizashi, and the hero slowly moved to tug Izuku out from behind Teddy's form. Nestling the child into his side, Hizashi very carefully maneuvered the child's head to rest Izuku's cheek on his shoulder, face hidden away from any probability of seeing Shouta as he were. "Hey, sweetheart," Hizashi murmured, leaving a shaking embrace on the boy's forehead. "You're all right. You're okay. It's gonna be okay, Mr. Shuda dash. He's gonna be fine, baby, I promise. Biba dash. The nice EMTs are gonna take him to the hospital, okay? And the doctors and nurses there will take care of him." And then, determinedly, "He's going to be fine, Izuku." Hizashi wasn't sure who he was trying to convince more, Izuku or himself. "Mr. Yamada," came a clear, sharp voice. Izuku flinched and the voice intoned again, much softer this time. "Mr. Yamada, can you please make a statement for us?" "Officer Sansa," Hizashi sighed in relief. Sansa was good with traumatized children, laying on his typically non-existent cat-like behaviors and qualities on thick to soothe them. And sure enough, when Sansa crouched next to Hizashi, he let out a small mew that had Izuku blinking in surprise. Then, the boy's eyes lit up a fraction, his attention span being partially dragged away from the EMTs and Shouta not a few yards away. "A human," Sansa offered with a gentle smile. "But I look very much like a cat, don't I?" "He looks like BSRD, Mr. Zashi." Hizashi spluttered, quickly wrangling words onto his tongue to explain to a chuckling Sansa that BSE was one of their cats. "I'm so sorry," Hizashi repeated for the third time, only stopping when Sansa held up a paw to quiet him. "It's fine," Sansa replied, his shoulders still shaking with a few remnants of laughter. "Let's get you and Izuku to the cruiser. I'll take your statements and then take you home." Statements. Because they'd just been attacked, assaulted, and here Hizashi was, chatting aimlessly about his fat tabby cat with Officer Sansa and Izuku while his husband was bleeding out in a dirty effing alleyway. Hizashi could deck himself. Holding a hand to the back of Izuku's head, pressing the child's face into his neck once more, Hizashi stood and made his way over to the cruiser, Teddy on his heels, very helpfully snarling at Sansa the entire way, making Hizashi roll his eyes. A quick glance told him that the ambulance had already loaded Shouta up and was clearly about to take off, if the EMTs slamming the doors shut was any indication. Hizashi's heart lurched, his stomach churning, and the sudden need to be next to his husband, holding Shuda's hand, embracing his forehead, cuddling up against his side, that urge overtook him for a moment. But then he noticed Izuku's bony knees digging into his side. He felt the child's warm breath on his collar, the shaking of the boy's hands as they burrowed into his jacket. Izuku was shivering all for that he was coated in sweat, his dark green locks matted to his forehead. He was a dad now. Or at least, a parental figure. A mentor in the child's life in the absence of a real father. Hizashi owed it to Izuku and to Shouta to stay with their kid. And so, Hizashi gave Sansa his statement, piling Izuku and Teddy into the back of the officer's cruiser. Izuku hardly let go of Hizashi the entire time, only letting go of the man's bicep long enough to tug on his seatbelt. And even then, his hands had been shaking too much to click it into place, so Hizashi leaned forward and helped the child. Teddy curled up on Izuku's lap, and the boy hid his face in the dog's fur once more. Leaning an arm over the boy, Hizashi laid his cheek atop Izuku's head, closing his eyes in the silence of the car, trying to purge the blood-stained image of his dying husband from his mind. From the beginning, Izuku had known his neighbors were pro-heroes, even if they had never said anything. Mr. Zashi was obviously present, Mike, what with his blonde hair and glasses and the plethora of put your hands up radio paraphernalia that seemed to consume his apartment. And Mr. Shouta was obviously a hero, too, even if Izuku wasn't quite sure exactly who he was. Most likely someone underground, because of the way he carried himself back to the wall, eyes casing every entry and exit way in a room, standing loose-limbed in case he needed to move quickly. It was how Izuku moved, albeit for very, very different reasons. But, heroes or not, Izuku didn't tell them. He didn't tell them he was quirkless, freak of nature, weak, geneless, not normal, because he was not afraid. Not of them. But of them leaving. His mother had died because he was quirkless. Kaken bullied him because he was quirkless. His father left because he was quirkless, only coming around long enough to pay rent and throw Izuku around a bit once every month. Izuku hadn't been sure if he should be happy or concerned that it had been months since his father last appeared. Izuku knew, of course, that Mr. Shouta and Mr. Hizashi were different. They were kind, feeding him, dressing his wounds, and they were protective, taking care of him when he was sick, and they cared about him. They did. He just didn't want them to stop. But now, because Izuku remained silent about his quirklessness, because he was a no-good, useless Deku, Mr. Shouta was hurt. He was hurt because Izuku couldn't do anything. Izuku had watched an interview with All Might a few years earlier. All Might's the #1 hero in all of Japan, had said something Izuku had never forgotten. "What makes a hero?" the interviewer had asked. All Might had chuckled his deep laugh, the noise echoing in Izuku's own zizi and making him light up. All great heroes, All Might had divulged, shared an experience much the same. In a time of great peril, their bodies seemed to move of their own accord. Their feet carried them into danger, and their arms and hands protected those who needed protecting. Their bodies just knew they were born to be heroes. Izuku had always thought he was born to be a hero. He protected other kids, younger, smaller kids, on the playground when Kaken got too rough. He had protected his mom, way back when he was small. But he hadn't protected Mr. Shouta. Mr. Shouta had gotten hurt, was probably dying, because Izuku was helpless to stop the bad guys, the villains. He was a useless, geneless, quirkless Deku. And he always would be. Which was why, while the police cruiser was driving them back to the apartment, Izuku hatched a plan. Mr. Hizashi would chase after him, not knowing about his quirklessness and not knowing to stay away, so Izuku would have to distract the man. Or wait for him to take his hearing aids out and fall asleep, which, seeing the way Mr. Hizashi's body was slumping with exhaustion, wouldn't take long. Where would Izuku go? He couldn't go home. Not only could Mr. Hizashi find him easily right next door, but even if he wasn't able to find Izuku, when the boy's father came home, if he heard about what Izuku had done, Izuku would be in for a royal black and blue beating. But Izuku had to run. He had to get away. After all, he couldn't hurt Mr. Hizashi or Mr. Shouta, if the man would even be alive to hurt if he wasn't there. He couldn't hurt anyone if he didn't exist. It was times like this that Izuku couldn't help but wish he'd never been born. Mr. Hizashi, even through his blatant exhaustion, lifted Izuku up into his arms, cradling him to his zizi like Izuku was 9 months and not 9 years old, and oh, yeah, it was his birthday today, wasn't it, and taking Mr. Teddy's leash in the hand that wasn't rubbing circles into Izuku's spine. The touch was comforting and, darn it, why was Izuku crying? He was a big crybaby. Kaken was right. A big, useless, weakling crybaby. Mr. Hizashi was murmuring soothing words to Izuku as he struggled to open the apartment door, kicking it shut behind him. Taking Mr. Teddy over to lay down on his bed, Mr. Hizashi ruffled the dog's ears and praised him. "Good boy. You did so good today, Teddy." Before turning to dodge Spork and BSRD, who weaved between his legs, as he went into the guest bathroom. "Hey, sweetheart," Mr. Hizashi murmured a little louder, ceasing his murmurs and pulling Izuku's face into his line of sight with a hand. "I need to go get changed. Do you think you can take a quick shower for me, kiddo? I'll put out some clean clothes for you." Mutely, Izuku nodded. Mr. Hizashi hesitated, looking conflicted, before he nodded and crouched to start the shower for Izuku. "I'll only be a few minutes, kiddo? And then I'll be right back. I just need to get out of this shirt, okay?" "Yeah." Because Mr. Hizashi's shirt was soaked red with Mr. Shuda's BLD. "Because you're a useless Deku." Kaken's voice screamed in his head. "Because you're just in the way and stealing everything from me," his father's voice echoed Kaken's. Izuku nodded again, too afraid he'd start crying once more if he spoke. Biting his lip, still looking concerned, Mr. Hizashi sighed and ran a gentle hand through Izuku's sweat-matted locks. "I'll just be a minute, sweetheart," he murmured, more to himself than to Izuku. "Just a minute." Izuku waited until Mr. Hizashi left, waited until he heard the click of the man's bedroom door shutting, waited until fog started building on the mirror and dampening his skin before he left the bathroom. Creeping as silently as he could, Izuku tiptoed past the bathroom, past the guest bedroom, past the M-star bed. Crying. Izuku heard crying. With a start, taking a moment longer than he should have, Izuku realized he heard Mr. Hizashi crying. It was muffled, wretched sobs that would have been louder had they not been stifled. Izuku knew that Mr. Hizashi must have been trying to keep quiet because of him. Mr. Hizashi was trying to keep quiet because of Izuku. Izuku didn't deserve Mr. Hizashi's kindness. He didn't deserve Mr. Hizashi trying to stay strong for him. Flashes of a large hand swatting him into his bedroom wall lit up behind Izuku's eyes, and he smacked a hand over his mouth to stifle his gasp. Mr. Hizashi would never hurt Izuku. Not like his father would. Not in a million, billion, zillion years. Izuku knew it. So why was he getting so scared? Silently, Izuku continued his tiptoe down the hall. He got to the front door, only interrupted once by BSRD, who was probably curious as to why his father wasn't home. Izuku silently apologized to the cat, patting BSRD's head as he sniffled. He'd missed the cats. He'd missed the morning breakfasts and the time spent around the table. He'd miss movie nights and morning walks and evening dinners and time spent with the two greatest fathers he could have ever wanted. He'd miss Mr. Teddy. He'd miss his dads. But he had to go. He had to leave, to get out of the apartment before he did any more harm to the people he'd grown to love so fiercely. Right when he got to the door, hand halfway outstretched towards the knob, Izuku felt a cold and wet nose nudge his cheek. Turning sharply, the child gasped and whispered out, "Mr. Teddy?" The dog had limped over from his bed and was now sitting right next to Izuku, his big, black eyes seemingly pleading with the boy. Mr. Teddy whimpered, liking Izuku's cheek twice, before he whimpered again, laying down at Izuku's feet and lowering his head, nibbling on the boy's shoe in a begging manner. And suddenly, Izuku couldn't contain himself. In earnest, Izuku began to sob. Hizashi couldn't breathe. The entire ride home, he'd been unable to take in a proper breath. And then, when he got Izuku home and had set the child down, he'd nearly vomited when he realized he was coated in his husband's BLD. As gently as he could, Hizashi begged Izuku to take a shower. He needed to change. He needed to get out of this shirt. He needed to breathe. Izuku, because he was an awesome, wonderful, thoughtful and caring and amazing child, nodded and let Hizashi escape for a moment. Because Hizashi couldn't breathe, and he was coated in his husband's BLD, and he needed to stay strong for Izuku but he couldn't breathe. Hizashi ripped his shirt off over his head, knocking one of his hearing aids askew. Quickly wetting a rag under their bathroom sink his and Shuda's, Shouda's, Hizashi rubbed down the skin of his wiping away the BLD that colored in the blackwork lines of his tattoos like a grotesque painting. Gagging, Hizashi immediately threw the rag in the garbage to be disposed of later. Because right now, Izuku needed him. Quickly redressing in a clean shirt, ignoring the way it clung to his damp skin, Hizashi turned and saw Shuda's pajamas lying on the floor, discarded in a haste to get ready for the day. And Shuda's slippers by the bed, knocked around as the man had likely kicked them off. And Shuda's book on the bedside table, a nerdy novel he'd been excited for, although he'd never show it. And suddenly, Hizashi was bubbling up like a pot over boiling. He still couldn't breathe. A wretched sob ripped its way from his lungs, and Hizashi quickly threw himself over the bed, burrowing his face in a pillow to muffle the sound. His shoulders racked with sobs, Hizashi attempted to console himself by rocking slowly, trying to ignore the weight of the world on his shoulders because he couldn't lose his Shouda. And then the hearing aid that hadn't been knocked askew picked up the sound of crying. Not Hizashi's crying. It was the soft, whimpering cry of a child. A child who had known too much of the darkest parts of the world around them. A child who had known abuse and abandonment and hatred for so long. And Hizashi felt immeasurably guilty. Immediately in his brain, Shuda's voice snapped at him. Don't be illogical, Hizashi. It's normal for you to be feeling these emotions. Just don't forget that he's feeling them, too, and the both of you will be alright. The Shouda in Hizashi's mind sounded far too much like he was saying goodbye, So Hizashi ignored him in favor of stealing his shoulders and quietly, slowly, making his way out into the hall. In a few short strides, Hizashi was at the helm of the apartment. And his heart cracked. Because Izuku was sitting there, curled into a ball once more, snuggling his face into Teddy's fur in an attempt to stifle his cries. "Oh, Aizu," Hizashi murmured, gently brushing Teddy over to the side at the dog's indignation and reaching down to lift Izuku into his arms. "It's okay, sweetheart. You can cry, Sprout." Whether it was the use of Shuda's nickname for him, or Hizashi's quiet consolations, Hizashi didn't know, but Izuku suddenly began to wail. It was wretched wails, the kind that a man faced by the death of his family or a child by the death of a father would make. Izuku's shoulders were lurching, his little lungs gasping for air as he wailed and wailed and wailed. Tears and snot were getting all over Hizashi's clean shirt, but the man couldn't bring himself to care. All he could care about right now was Izuku. His kid. His son. Their eyes. There, sweetheart, you're okay? You're gonna be fine. And then Izuku gasped out, "Pee Papa." And oh, Hizashi startled, something pinging around in his heart, that was what that felt like. "Pee Papa, Papa, Papa dash," Izuku sobbed out, rubbing at his eyes with one hand and grabbing at Hizashi's arm with the other. "Pee Papa, Daddy is dash. Papa, Daddy." They were dads. Izuku saw them as his fathers. And oh yeah, Hizashi and Shouda would be enacting those late-night plans ASAP. Izuku began again, only for his lungs to begin failing him. Hizashi realized with a start that the child was having a panic attack. "Oh, kiddo, it's okay. Breathe, sweetheart, just breathe with me. Okay? 2, 3, 4. Out 2, 3, 4. Hizashi repeated the words, placing Izuku's hand on his T so that his child could feel the rise and fall and try to mimic it. It took a while, although time seemed irrelevant anyways, until Izuku managed to calm down. But, through trying to soothe his kid, Hizashi managed to get his own breathing under control as well. "There, kiddo," Hizashi murmured. "You're alright. We're alright. We're dash." But Izuku's next words caught Hizashi off guard. "Pee Papa, I'm so sorry." "Kiddo dash," Hizashi started, utterly bewildered, because why was Izuku apologizing? Hizashi and Shouda were the heroes. They were the adults. They were the ones who should have been protecting Izuku, and the ones that should have been apologizing. But Izuku cut Hizashi short once more, and the boy stuttered out, It's my FF fault. Because I'm a WW worthless, geneless Deku. Geneless." Hearing the slur fall from his kid's lips was startling, especially when the child was referring to himself. And really, Hizashi and Shouda had thought for some time that Izuku may have been quirkless. After all, most kids his age had no qualms or hesitations in showing off their quirks whenever they could. And even Izuku, as shy as he was, showed off in other ways. His hero analysis journals were one of his favorite things to share with them, and Shouda and Hizashi were always eager to share their own thoughts with the boy. It was an exercise in bonding, one that had drawn them all close. So close, in fact, that Izuku now called Hizashi Papa. But there were other things Hizashi needed to address. Namely, Izuku's opinion of himself. Gently setting the boy down, Hizashi took a gentle hold of the child's face, a palm on either cheek. It said something that the boy didn't even flinch when Hizashi did so, and the man was nearly taken aback by the utter trust his child had in him. "Izuku, I need you to listen to me, sweetheart. Okay? Please tell me you're listening." "I'm listening," Izuku hiccuped, taking in a deep breath and letting it out through his mouth. Hizashi smiled softly, gently, as sincerely as he could. "You are not worthless. And you are not a nobody. You are not any of the terrible things people have told you in the past, kiddo. But I'm QQ Quirkless dash. And I don't care, Izuku." Hizashi spoke emphatically, pummeling past the child's defenses and making Izuku let loose a tiny gasp. "Shouda doesn't either. We love you no matter what, and there is nothing wrong with being quirkless. Do you hear me, kiddo?" I don't understand." Izuku trailed off into hiccups. Hizashi shushed him quietly, running a hand through the boy's matted green locks. "I know, sweetheart. But I'll keep telling you until you believe it, okay? There's nothing wrong with you. You are not worthless or useless, and you are certainly not geneless, okay? The slur felt horrible on Hizashi's tongue, but he needed so desperately for Izuku to understand him, to know that what Hizashi said was true. Even if Izuku couldn't believe it now, he would one day. Hizashi would make sure of it. I love you so much, kiddo, Hizashi said. After a beat of quiet, the stillness only interrupted by Izuku's heavy breathing and the mewling of Beiyen's spork in the background, Izuku mumbled, "P promise?" And oh, if Hizashi's heart couldn't break any more for his boy. "I promise, Aizu. Do you want a hug?" Izuku let loose one more brief sob as he nodded frantically, lunging into Hizashi's arms before the man could even tilt forward to embrace the child. Wrapping his arms around his kid, Hizashi breathed into Izuku's sweaty hair, leaving an embrace on the crown of the boy's head. Humming quietly, he rocked back and forth until Izuku's heavy breathing stilled. "Are you ready for a bath, kiddo?" Mutely, Izuku nodded. All throughout the child's bath, Izuku yawned and rubbed at bleary eyes. Hizashi washed the child's hair, rinsing thoroughly and putting a leave-in conditioner in the child's curls that would leave them soft and silky. It was something Hizashi had bought for Shuda, something the man refused to use and left sitting in their guest bathroom. When Izuku began listing off to the side, Hizashi chuckled and dropped a towel over the child's head. "Get dried off, kiddo. I'll go shower and grab you some clothes, okay?" "Papa." And there it was again. "Papa." The only thing that could make this better was Shuda being there. And not being in the hospital, bleeding out from a knife wound, likely fighting for his life. Showering as quickly as he could, foregoing his usual hair routine, which he knew he'd regret later, Hizashi grabbed a fresh pair of boxer shorts and a small hoodie from their dresser before returning to the guest bathroom. Knocking on the door, opening it at Izuku's tiny, "Come in," Hizashi saw that Izuku had dressed back into his underwear and t-shirt. "Here you go, kiddo. I didn't think we'd have much your size, but I tried." A short shrug from the man made Izuku giggle, and Hizashi mentally counted that as a win. Izuku dressed in the hoodie, a hot pink monstrosity with cats on the front that Nomuri had bought for Shuda as a joke. It had somehow accidentally been thrown in the dryer where it shrunk 2 sizes too small, and tugged on the boxer shorts, stumbling around as he did so. Socks. The little boy all but begged, even though he didn't need to. Hizashi would do anything for his kid at the moment, and Hizashi retrieved the fluffiest pair of socks in the house for the boy. The crew socks went all the way up to his knees where the boxer shorts just barely didn't cover, and the hoodie covered the child from mid-thigh down his arms, a good few inches past his fingertips. "Nap time, kiddo," Hizashi murmured to the boy as Izuku yawned widely once more. "Mr. Teddy?" Izuku mumbled, and Hizashi chuckled as he picked the boy up. He may have grunted a bit too, but it was good that Izuku was finally gaining weight eating with them. He was still far too small for his age, but he'd put on some muscle and a good amount of chub for a kid. "Sure, sweetheart, we'll get Teddy." As if summoned by his name, Teddy appeared in the living room as the duo entered it, giving a soft woof as Hizashi gently tossed Izuku onto the couch. The child giggled a bit, but ultimately wrapped an arm around Teddy's neck as the dog jumped onto the couch and let his eyes flutter shut. "Good night, Aizu. I'll wake you up in a little bit, okay?" He needed to call Tsukachi to get an update on Shuda. If anyone could wrangle the truth out of a nurse on Hizashi's husband's condition, it would be the human lie detector. And besides, Hizashi needed to call Nomuri and Tensei and Shuda's moms and... Hizashi let out a yawn, rubbing a hand over his face. Looking over at his kid, nestled up on the couch with their dog, the man couldn't help but smile. He was worried but Shuda was strong and stubborn, the most mulish man Hizashi had ever had the pleasure of falling in love with. He'd be alright. Hizashi could close his eyes for a moment. Just a single moment. And then he'd wake up and drag Izuku to the hospital, where Shuda would be recovering from surgery. Everything was going to work out fine. For a long while, all Shuda knew were swirling lights and sirens. He could feel cold sweat dripping all over him, and hands were pressing against his neck and wrists and torso. A hand pressed particularly strong against his ribcage, and Shuda bit back a groan. Someone said his name, but it wasn't anyone he knew. Actually, he didn't know anyone who was surrounding him. But if he was in an ambulance, surely Hizashi would be with him. Unless he'd been injured on patrol, but then again no. It hadn't been patrol, it had been. Izuku Shouta coughed out, attempting to sit up. Hizashi and Aizawa. Mr. Aizawa, please lay down, a paramedic spoke sternly to him. You're injured and we're trying to take care of you, okay? If there were any rules that had been hammered into Shouta in his time attending UA, it was to listen to the goddamn paramedics, because they know what they're doing better than you. And so, despite his brain screaming at him, run, find Hizashi, find Izuku, protect my family, Shouta laid back down on the cot, coughing up more BLD, and tried to focus on the paramedic's voice. Ultimately he failed. And finally he passed out. Hizashi and Izuku slept straight through the morning into the early afternoon. It was only when Izuku started making little nightmare-induced whimpers, earning loud whines from Teddy, that Hizashi began to awaken. Speaking in gentle, soothing tones, Hizashi stirred his kid awake, earning a teary-eyed look from the boy. Hizashi crooned and ran a hand through Izuku's hair, saying softly, "Why don't you go grab something from the snack cabinet, okay, kiddo? I've got to make a few phone calls." The call with Shuda's mothers was longer than it should have been, what with Yumi demanding answers to her son's condition that Hizashi didn't have. Fortunately, Michiko was able to rein her wife in and told Hizashi to call them back when he'd seen Shouta. The call to work was the most brief of all the calls he made, seeing as how Nedzu already knew everything that went down everywhere and with everyone, especially his employees. Nedzu told Hizashi to take the next few days off, and that he would take care of Shuda's responsibilities, whatever that meant. Hizashi didn't know and didn't want to. His phone call with Tsukachi told Hizashi only the barest of details, the detective instead leaving anything beyond, "He's alive and out of surgery," for Hizashi to discover when they got to the hospital. And so, with a sigh, Hizashi walked to the kitchen, absolutely melting at the sight of Izuku skinning down a jelly pouch, grape, Shuda's favorite flavor, and crouched in front of his child. "Hey, kiddo," the man began, "I need you to run next door to grab some proper clothes but Hizashi stopped short upon seeing Izuku's utterly horrified face. "Aizu? Kiddo? What's Leave me, Papa Izuku stuttered out, choking on a sob. Please don't make me leave Ish sweetheart," Hizashi crooned, holding his arms out for Izuku to leap into. The child burrowed his face in Hizashi's shoulder, and the man rocked him gently. "I'm not leaving you, okay? Let's head over together and get you some clothes. We've got to get dressed so we can go see Daddy, right?" "Alright," Izuku sniffled, nodding his head firmly. And wasn't that something Hizashi loved about his kid? Izuku's determination and drive that managed to power past his paralyzing fear and anxiety. The kid was always ready to help others, although Hizashi wouldn't rest until others turned to others and himself. After letting Teddy out to use the bathroom and feeding all of their pets, sending Nomuri a quick text to run over and please let Teddy out in the morning, because Hizashi had a feeling they'd be spending the night at the hospital, Hizashi turned and allowed Izuku to lead the way towards the neighboring apartment. And Izuku seemed nervous. It was a different kind of nervous than Hizashi had seen from the boy before. This kind of nervous wasn't about fear of physical punishment, it was more fear of judgment. Izuku looked like Hizashi was going to tease him or be verbally cruel, which Hizashi was not going to stand for. "Hey, kiddo," Hizashi stopped Izuku short from the front door. He had half a mind to ask Izuku if the boy wanted him to wait outside, but seeing as how the idea of leaving Izuku had gone earlier, "You know I love you, right? And I'm not going to judge you for anything that's beyond your control, okay?" Izuku's shoulders relaxed, and the boy nodded. "Yeah, okay, Papa." He nodded, reaching up to unlock the door to the apartment that Hizashi had nightmares about. And really, Hizashi had expected more. Maybe he'd expected it to be dirtier, or bug-infested, or burned to a crisp. But he hadn't expected it to look so bare. The first thing Hizashi noticed was the lack of anything. There was no TV, no couch, no coffee or side tables. There were no cushions or photos on the walls or anything to make the apartment seem homey. A quick glance into the kitchen while Izuku was shutting the front door spoke volumes. There were empty beer bottles in the trash and on the countertop, along with a stack of mail that looked like overdue bills. Moving through the hallway with Izuku leading him by hand, Hizashi glanced around and noted that the bathroom and Dimsar bedroom were both empty as well. Not to forget, there was a musty scent that filled the apartment as though it had been unused for months on end. Perhaps even it all filled Hizashi with a sense of dread. Upon reaching Izuku's bedroom, a simple All Might-themed plaque on the door reading the boy's name in a child's handwriting, Hizashi's heart crashed into his stomach when he saw inside. There were a few blankets and a lone, long flattened pillow lying in the corner of the room, away from the windows where the heat of summer would seep through. Izuku's bright yellow backpack took up another corner, along with a spread of analysis papers and pens and homework. A pile of clothing was stacked next to the backpack, most looking either too wrinkled or overworn. Finally, there was also a single plush toy residing next to the makeshift cot. It was a cat-shaped toy that Shouda had found at the checkout lane at the supermarket and had thoughtlessly tossed into their basket to buy for Izuku. It was the only toy that Izuku had. "Oh, sweetheart," Hizashi murmured near silently to himself as Izuku went over to the pile of clothes, looting around for a particular shirt. He must have found what he was looking for, because the ghost of a smile crossed over Izuku's features, and he tugged a bright green Put Your Hands Up radio t-shirt from the stack. A bright green t-shirt that Hizashi had brought home from work for him, having extra merch that hadn't all sold yet and thinking that Izuku may like it. The things they'd given to their child so thoughtlessly. A cat toy. A t-shirt. And here was all Izuku had. "Kiddo," Hizashi began again, speaking a little louder. "How long has it been since your dad's been home?" Izuku flinched. It was a full-body motion that ripped a hole through Hizashi's already wounded heart. The boy began, and then quietly, "I don't know," Izuku sniffled, rubbing at his eyes, and said, "The lady at the office said that he hadn't paid her money for our home, so she needed it. The money. But I don't have any money, and I. Izuku's breath was picking up at a dangerous rate, so Hizashi moved in a flash to be right in front of his kid. He worked the child through a breathing exercise, murmuring soothingly to the boy as he stroked Izuku's curls. "It's okay, kiddo. We can talk about this more later, yeah? When we're with Daddy." Izuku gave the most pitiful okay that Hizashi had ever heard. Once Izuku was dressed, Hizashi hefted the boy onto his hip and embraced his forehead, taking the child out of that dreaded hellhole and back to their home. Their home. Because it wasn't just Hizashi's and Shuda's apartment anymore. Looking back, Hizashi supposed they'd needed more than a new dog to fill the hole that was in their house. A child was what they were missing. And Hizashi and Shouda had lucked out. They'd gotten the best one. In the end, Hizashi decided to wait on the conversation about Izuku's living situation until Shouda was a little more healed. Because when they got to the hospital, Shouda was barely lucid with the painkillers and healing quirks he had been subjected to. He was even loopy enough to give Hizashi a loud, resounding embrace on the cheek that had Izuku in a fit of giggles. Due to the healing quirks Shouda had been placed under, he was cleared merely 2 days after he'd been injured. Hizashi had, of course, agreed to allow Izuku to miss school that Monday to see Shouda home. He was, after all, able to make that decision now, being one of Izuku's legal guardians. It was only thanks to Tsukachi's pull that they were able to get the adoption paperwork so quickly. Hizashi, with input from his husband, filled out all of the necessary papers to make sure Izuku could come home with them that very Monday. He also called their apartment complex and told their landlord that the Midoriya place needed to be condemned and the locks replaced, briefly giving the woman the shallowest of explanations that he and Shouda had taken on their young neighbor. The woman had spouted, "Good. Lord knows his father is a deadbeat," to which Hizashi had readily agreed. After a few more phone calls to Nemuri, to Tensei, to Michiko and Yumi, and to Hizashi's own family, Izuku was finally a part of their little family. Now, there was only one more matter to be settled. "So, Hizashi exclaimed with a wide grin as he finished the last of the paperwork, only one line blank. "There's one more thing we need to take care of." From his position sitting on the hospital bed next to Shouda, the man's arms slung around the child lazily as he read a book and Izuku peeled apart a baby orange. Izuku looked up curiously. "What, Papa?" Shouda choked a little at that, still not used to hearing it from Izuku. Hizashi himself could only grin even wider back at his child. Your name? Hizashi cheered. Your last name, to be precise. Izuku tilted his head to the side, clearly confused. What about it? Shouta rolled his eyes, nudging Izuku gently and speaking softly, you're allowed to change it if you want. Yeah. To Aizawa Yamada, or Yamada Aizawa, Hizashi waggled his eyebrows, making Izuku giggle, or even just Aizawa or just Yamada. Only if you want to, Shouta quickly amended. There's no pressure to change it if you don't want to. Frowning down at the peels of orange in his lap, Izuku chewed over the piece in his mouth silently. For a moment, there was only the sound of Hizashi's tapping foot and the turning of a page in Shuda's book. And then, so quietly, so unsurely, Izuku spoke. What about? What about Yamazawa? And oh, Shouta thought to himself, maybe this feeling is what Zashi was talking about. Because Aizawa Yamada and Yamada Aizawa are T2 big AN, and I don't wanna have just one of Y or N names, SO dash. Sounds perfect, sweetheart, Hizashi crooned, writing the last name down with a flourish. He very well wished he and Shouta could change their last names as well, but what with their relationship being on the down low, especially from their gossipy students, it wouldn't do well for them to have the same surname. Izuku's shrieking giggles drew Hizashi away from the paperwork, and he melted when he saw Shouta tickling the boy's ribs with a finger. Daddy! Izuku shrieked. Stop it! It tickles! Dutifully, Shouta stopped, leaving Izuku's little psyche heaving with heavy breaths and the remnants of laughter. Hizashi's grin could have split his face, and even Shouta was sporting a smile. A knock on the door drew their attention, and a nurse poked his head in. He was a nice young man with a type of fish quirk that gave him fins on either side of his head, and Izuku had adored drilling the man for information on his gills and lungs and how the rest of his quirk worked. All of which the nurse answered patiently as he tended to Shouta, earning the approval from Izuku's guardians. Ready to bust out of here? The nurse inquired, smiling at Izuku's chirping affirmative response. Let me get the wheelchair. Getting home was easy enough, what with Namuri picking them up and dropping them off. The woman gushed over each and every little thing Izuku did, and Shouta proclaimed of a headache halfway home, earning a glare from said woman. She turned to Izuku and chided, "Your daddy is such a stick in the mud." "No, he's not," Izuku retorted obstinately. He's the best. He's N nice and F funny and he's my favorite H-hero. What? Hizashi exclaimed, only Shuda's red-eyed glare keeping his voice non-quirked. Little listener, why? Hizashi pretend sobbed, earning an eye roll from his husband and a damp giggle. From Izuku. Izuku's answer was so quiet that the adults in the car almost missed it. She fights Quirkless. Hizashi's heart softened, and he exchanged a glance with his husband over Izuku's head. Shouta looked contemplative and confused, and Hizashi signed to him later, "Babe," to which the man nodded. The rest of the car ride was filled with Namuri's sobbing over Izuku's cuteness and Hizashi's singing to the radio. Shouta proclaimed a headache once more. Even as he smiled down into his shirt collar, Izuku pressed up against him contentedly. When they finally got home, their entire family collapsed onto the MSTR room's king-sized bed, allowing all three of their pets to hop up with them. Shouta and Hizashi were flanking Izuku on either side, the child wrapping a hand around both of their shirts as he quickly succumbed to sleep. Teddy curled up against their feet while Spork settled on Shuda's pillow, right above his head like a hat, and BSRD curled up in the nook of Hizashi's drawn-up knees. Carding his fingers through Shuda's hair, Hizashi leaned forward and gently embraced his husband. "I love you, Sho," he spoke quietly, earning the softest of smiles back from Shouta. "Love you too, Zashi." Shouta was awoken from his sleep by a violent knock on the door. Glancing over at the alarm clock, he glared harshly when he noticed it was 2 a.m. But the knock came again, even more violent and loud than before, and Shouta quickly turned to make sure Izuku hadn't woken up. He was unconcerned about Hizashi, knowing his husband wouldn't be able to hear the knocking without his hearing aids. But Izuku was blessedly still asleep, likely exhausted from the anxiety and excitement of the past few days. Dragging himself out of bed and wrapping his capture scarf around his neck, Shoyuda made his way towards the front door as quickly as his drag-addled and injured body would let him. Glancing through the peephole, he could only see darkness. With a frown, Shoyuda gripped his capture weapon in one hand, hidden behind the door, as he tugged it open a fraction. There, in front of him, stood a man with dark, curly hair and lightly tanned skin. He had freckles over his cheeks and a glazed, drunken look in his eyes. Shuda's gaze narrowed, because, for the first time ever, he was meeting Hisashi Midoriya. The man in front of Shoyuda was swaying on his feet, but the pure and utter rage behind his eyes was what really made Shoyuda tense up. A twinge in his gut reminded him of his still-healing injury even as he drew the door open more to face Midoriya head-on. "Can I help you?" Shoyuda ground out, gritting his teeth as he fought the violent urge to jump forward and beat the living daylights out of Midoriya. The man grunted, his furious gaze lazily dragging from Shoyuda to the vacant apartment next door and back to Shoyuda. "My apartment's locked." "And?" Shoyuda huffed out, crossing his arms over his settee and drawing himself to his full 6-foot height. Midoriya seemed to be an inch or two shorter than him, some primal instinct in Shoyuda gleefully realized. "How does that correlate to you slamming on my door at 2 o'clock in the morning?" It would be best not to agitate the man, but Shoyuda couldn't help but snark a bit at Midoriya. After all, this was the man that had abused and neglected Shuda's kid. Not Midoriya's. Because the man had lost all right to being Izuku's father the first time he ever laid a hand on the child. Midoriya grunted and swayed a bit more before huffing out, "No good busy brat." "What did he do?" "Get me locked out," and then, under his breath, the man grunted, "I'll fucking kill that brat dash." "I suggest you leave," Shoyuda grit out from behind clenched teeth. "It wouldn't do for you to go making death threats at 2 o'clock in the morning. Someone may take you seriously and call the authorities." The thin veil around the threat was, unfortunately, too thin. Midoriya snarled, swinging a fist around to slam into the frame of the doorway, right next to Shuda's head. Shoyuda didn't even flinch. His gaze narrowing, Shoyuda spoke low and even, "Don't go getting violent, now. It wouldn't be good for you, Mr. Midoriya." "You fucking know me?" the man slurred back. "Do you know my brat? Is he here?" "You fucking hidin' my little BSD from me dash." "Your kid isn't here," Shoyuda spoke evenly. "My husband and son are asleep, though. I suggest you leave before you wake them up and I have to file a noise violation." Midoriya snarled out, "Why I outta fucking fgots hidin' my fucking kid from me dash?" And then, Midoriya made his fatal mistake. He reached out, fully intending to put Shoyuda in a stranglehold with one hand. "FNG finally," Shoyuda thought. Then he moved. Snatching Midoriya's wrist, Shoyuda slung the man over his hip, ignoring the protest from his gut, and knocked his head against the bottom of the doorframe. Midoriya's mouth began to smoke, and he opened it to spew fire. A foot appeared from nowhere, kicking Midoriya strong in the crown of his head. The man's eyes rolled back, and the combination of blunt force trauma and alcohol made him pass out cold. Shoyuda glanced up, grinning at his husband. Hizashi had a narrowed glare on Midoriya, one hand holding back a snarling teddy while the other was pointed towards the hallway, keeping Izuku out of visible range. "I've already called the authorities," Hizashi spoke coldly. "They'll be here any minute. He'll be arrested for trying to assault a pro-hero, as well as child abuse and neglect." Hizashi's foot twitched, and he said under his breath so that only Shoyuda could hear, "I'm strong pressed to kick the BSRD again." "Don't," Shoyuda had to fight himself to say. "We don't want you arrested for murder, Hizashi." "Fine, fine." Hizashi waved his hand in the air lackadaisically. "I'm gonna go tend to our baby. Make sure this guy gets what's coming to him, babe." "It'll be my pleasure," Shoyuda answered honestly as he pressed Midoriya's hands behind his back. The arrest was easy. Once more, Sansa was on the scene. The officer was kind to Izuku, who was shaking, crying, smiling, and laughing all at once. Purring to the boy, Sansa made sure Midoriya was locked up tight while the little Yamazawa was tucked away under a shock blanket, tightly secured in his father's arms. It was impossible to get Izuku back to sleep after everything, so at the ripe hour of 4 a.m. Hizashi turned on the radio and began to sing as he busied himself making pancakes in the kitchen. Shoyuda gathered up spork and bsrd and dumped them on Izuku's head and lap, making the child giggle as sandpaper tongues from said cats licked at him in an attempt to comfort. Teddy, ever the loyal dog, curled up around Izuku's feet, and the boy's legs were just barely long enough for him to bury his bare toes in the dog's wild fur. Shoyuda grabbed a coffee for himself, choosing to sit at the table next to Izuku rather than lean against the bar next to his husband. Hizashi winked at him, embracing at the air before turning back to the bacon and eggs he was nursing at the stove. With a heavy sigh, Shoyuda turned and ran his fingers through Izuku's curls. He noted that it was nearly time for the child to get a haircut, should he want one. He said as much, and Izuku shook his head firmly. "I want to grow it out," the boy protested softly. "Like Pop and Daddy." Just when Shoyuda thought his heart couldn't melt any more for his kid. The day went on as a normal day off would for the small family, save for the long-lingering presence of Izuku as the boy would typically be off at. And truthfully, Shoyuda and Hizashi wouldn't have it any other way. The child stood on a stool to help Hizashi dry their dishes, and he did light yoga with Shoyuda in the living room. They all curled up on the couch to read for a while, Izuku muttering to himself as he pored over his journals and rewrote some of his notes. Hizashi fondly cuddled the child in his lap until Shoyuda shoved his husband over, claiming it was his turn for Izuku cuddles. This ended in a tickle fight, with Izuku somehow making his way to the center of the pile. Breathless from laughter, Izuku looked up at his papa and daddy, both of whom were staring down at the child with varying grins. "Papa? Daddy? Yes, Aizu? I love you." Hizashi sniffled, blinking back tears. "I love you too, sweetheart." "We love you," Shoyuda corrected, tangling his fingers with his husband's. "Don't ever forget that." A few hours later, Shoyuda and Hizashi presented Izuku with leftover cake and his birthday presents. The child cried softly upon opening up Shuda's custom-ordered toy that was made to look exactly like Teddy, then bawled when he opened up Hizashi's homemade scrapbook. Inside were pictures of Izuku with Teddy, Izuku with Shoyuda and Hizashi, Izuku with the cats and walking outside and having fun and loving life. There were a few pictures Izuku hadn't expected as well, wedding pictures of Hizashi and Shoyuda, pictures of them in high school, and even a small photograph of a young Hizashi with his sisters and a young Shoyuda with his mothers. "Those are your grandmothers," Shoyuda told his son gently. "If you want to meet them, dash." "Yes," Izuku said emphatically, hiccuping and sniffling. "Yes, I want to meet them. Please." Hizashi grinned back, pressing an embrace to Izuku's temple. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll set something up for next week, yeah?" Izuku also wanted to meet Hizashi's sisters, which both of his parents knew immediately would be a trip and a half. Especially with Hizashi's nieces and nephews. It was later, after the presents and laughter and the joy, that Hizashi and Shoyuda finally set Izuku down on the couch to talk. "Izuku," Shoyuda began quietly. "Hizashi told me about the other day. How you thought me getting hurt was somehow your fault." Tears welled up in the little boy's eyes for the umpteenth time that day, and he opened his mouth, likely to say something along the lines of "because it was," but Shoyuda interrupted him. "Izuku, it isn't your fault I got hurt. I am both a pro-hero and your father. I will always step in between you and danger, because that's what I want to and am here to do. If that means I get hurt, then I get hurt. But it is not your fault. And we'll always do our best to come home to you," Hizashi quickly added. "Izuku, we want to protect you, because we love you." Even though, the child started, stammering up a storm. "Even Tom, I'm Quirkless?" Shuda's gaze softened, and he nodded. "Even then, Izuku. Even though there's nothing wrong with being quirkless, and even if you do something you're not supposed to do, and even if you were a villain, we would always try to protect you. Just don't go being a villain, sweetheart, because we don't want to arrest you, okay?" Hizashi chuckled, and Izuku giggled wetly. "AP Papa." "Good," Shoyuda said, standing up and ignoring the protest from his knees. Hizashi giggled at the popping noise they made, and Shoyuda punched his husband's arm lightly. "Now, let's go take a nap." The nap was wonderful, and the little family, all snuggled up with Teddy and the cats, slept soundly, blessedly unbothered by the world, for several hours. Epilogue. It was with pain in his back and flank that Shouda sat up on the sparring mat, grinning widely at his son. You managed to throw me that time. Good job. The 13-year-old blushed darkly, rubbing the back of his neck beneath his ponytail where dark green curls were coming unwound. You let me. When have I ever lied to you? When you and Pops told me Santa was real. Shouda paused, then countered, when have I ever lied to you about your training? Meekly, Izuku began to smile down at the ground. Never. Hey, chin up, Shouda gently chided his son as he went to stand next to Izuku. Yeah. Hizashi shouted from the sidelines as he stretched, warming up for his turn at a spar. You know we love to see your smiles, Zuzu. Izuku blanched at the nickname, quickly whirling towards his other father and shouting back. Pops, do not call me that at school. Please. No promises, Zuzu. Shouda started, quickly interjecting himself between his husband and son as to not let some kind of fight break out. We'll treat you with the same dignity and respect as our other students, kiddo. That being said, if you manage to find another alleyway Scrabble to get into Dash. Hey, it's not vigilantism if I'm not using a quirk. Even Tsukachi said so. It's obviously not vigilantism, Izuku rambled, poking at his father with a bare foot and wiggling his toes. Pinky joint and everything. From the sidelines, Hizashi shouted again. That science is flawed. Whatever, pups. Vigilantism aside, Shouda said as he crouched in front of his son, placing a fist against the boy's tee, I don't want you getting into any more fights, okay? Not beyond the sparring mat. Do you understand, problem child? Izuku scoffed. Not a problem child. Izuku. Yes, Dad, I understand. My God, it's not like I'm gonna challenge Bakugo to a fight to the death or something during the admissions exam. Wouldn't put it past you. Hizashi called as he sidled up to his family, an older and slower Teddy slinking up after him. Tugging his husband and son in for a group hug, dutifully ignoring Shuda's scoff, Hizashi embraced both of his boys on their cheeks before crouching down to ruffle Teddy's fur. The dog barked happily, leaning into the touch and liking at Hizashi's wrist. Wow, Hizashi said suddenly. I never thought of this before, but, glancing over at his son, who had moved away from the group hug to go run some stretches of his own, Hizashi murmured to his husband, if not for Teddy, we may never have gotten Aizu. Shouda paused, thinking it over, before slowly nodding back. Yeah. We would have taken that mail he was bringing to us and not thought anything more of it. For him, Teddy gave a small woof, and Hizashi turned back to where he'd stopped scratching behind the dog's ear. All right, boy, all right. You'll get an extra treat tonight, how about that? For being such a good boy and all. It's almost that day, you know? The date's the anniversary of when they'd gotten to adopt Izuku. All of the official paperwork had taken a few more months to process, of course, but the day Izuku had chosen their names, was coming up, and it would be a big one. 5 years, Shouda said quietly, drawing his husband's attention. Hizashi hummed. Can't wait for 10. And 15. Then 20. And dash. Pops, are we gonna spar or not? Izuku called back, twirling his bow's staff up into the air and catching it as it came back down. Shouda chuckled, smacking Hizashi's back and shoving him towards their kid. Best not keep him waiting. Never would, Sho. We've been through that already. It's best to not wait a day longer. Hey, you're that kid from the entrance exam, shouted the bubbly, brown-haired girl. Izuku didn't know her name, but she was surrounded by a small gaggle of friends. A girl with a frog quirk and dark green hair to match Izuku's, a tall boy with glasses, and then a blonde boy with light blue eyes. Wait, you know Zuzu? None other than Minoma Nito shouted, and Izuku rolled his eyes. Really, cat boy, you shouldn't be shouting in a classroom, he replied impishly, earning a scoff from his cousin. It's Nito, not Nico, you dash. I'm Tsuyu Asi, the frog girl interrupted, rebutting as she hopped to stand between the cousins. That's Ochako Uraraka, and this is Dash. Tenya Ida. It is very nice to meet you. Welcome to 1A, the hero course. You're transferring from support, right? Tsuyu inquired, a finger pointed at her lower lip as she tilted her head to the side. That's cool. Even cooler, Ochako interrupted her friend's train of thought, because he won the sports festival. The entire thing. Go, what's your name again? Grinning from ear to ear, Izuku introduced himself with a bow. Sorry about that, I forgot. My name is Izuku Yamazawa. Thank you for accepting me to your class. I hope we can all be good friends. The chorus of cheers coming from the small group in front of him made Izuku huff with laughter. However, movement from the corner of his eye drew Izuku's attention to the back of the classroom. A boy with duotoned hair and a scar over his eye caught Izuku's gaze, but only for a moment. The boy was quickly looking back down at his desk, not speaking to anyone around him. Well, that just won't do, Izuku thought to himself. Looks like I've got another friend to make today. He was cut off by Hitoshi rushing up behind him and slinging an arm around his neck, nearly strangling the life out of him. Toshi, what the dash? Uncle Shouta says class is about to start, so you'd better take your seats, hero kids. Dude, you're a hero kid too now. Nevertheless, the two transfer students dutifully sat at their seats, Hitoshi right in front of Izuku, at the front of the class. The other students just barely managed to find their ways to their seats before the door was slamming open and Izuku's father was slinking his way into the classroom, eyes narrowed over his suspiciously silent students. Catching Izuku's gaze, Shouta huffed when he realized one of his nephews and his son must have tipped the other kids off. Turning to the podium, Shouta cleared his throat and said, "Welcome, newcomers, to Class 1A. Izuku beamed back because not only was this one of his fathers, one of his teachers, this was one of his heroes. Someone he was going to be like someday. And he would. Someday, Izuku would also rescue a small child. A little girl with white hair and a power that was too strong for her body. A little girl who was feared by those around her, except for those who knew her best. Her family. Her cousins, Nito and Hitoshi, her grandmothers, Yumi and Michiko, her fathers, Hizashi and Shouta. But mostly, her big brother, Izuku Yamazawa. And someday soon she would smile.